And hello and welcome to this PVI webinar, which is all about the beginnings of health technology assessment. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Anne Single and I'm the Patient Voice Initiative Coordinator, and I'm going to be moderating this session today. And the reason I'm here is I'm delighted to say that our chair, patient advocate Jessica Bean, is actually on leave caring for her beautiful new baby girl. Before we start, I want to acknowledge the Yagara and the Turrbal as the traditional custodians of the land where I'm living and working, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So you may know that the Patient Voice Initiative aims to ensure patients are seen, heard and valued in healthcare decision making, especially health technology assessment. And health technology assessment is used by governments around the world to determine the value of new health interventions, to subsidise their costs to patients. That process determines whether they're of good value or sufficiently good value for governments to do that subsidy. So in Australia, this is the process which guides decisions about what the Australian government funds on the Medicare benefit schedule and the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. And just a reminder that health technologies are any health intervention. And can I just ask you all to mute your microphones? Apologies, that's me during the setup. I should have had you come in on mute, but if you hit mute, that will just help with some of the sound quality there. So just a reminder that health technologies are any health intervention that could be something to diagnose a condition, like a blood test. They could be something to treat a condition, like a medicine, or they could be something to prevent a condition, like a vaccine or an exercise program. And essentially, health technology assessment, often called HTA, is a process whereby the evidence of benefit and cost is considered to see if the new intervention is cost effective or good value for money compared to the existing treatment or care. And at Patient Voice Initiative, we agree with the international definition of health technology assessment, which recognises that the value determined for a health intervention depends on the domains you consider, but it also is influenced by who is involved in the assessment. Because depending on your perspective, you might ask different questions about a new health intervention to determine its value to you. So a patient or their family might ask different questions about a new medicine than their doctor would, or than a health researcher might ask. And these different questions may mean that they need different evidence to answer them. And that may result in a different determination of their value. So the questions we ask about health technology assessments, health technologies, are very important. It's because we think these questions we start with and how they are framed is so important that I'm excited to host this webinar today, which is about the beginning of an assessment and how patient communities can add knowledge there. At the moment in Australia, we can't do this in medicines, which are assessed at PBAC, but we can do it at the Medical Services Advisory Committee, and that's sometimes called MSAC, which assesses medical services. So that's where we're focusing today. And just a reminder, if you've just joined us, to hit the mute on your microphone, just to help everyone have good sound quality. Thanks very much for doing that. So the format we'll be using in this webinar is we're going to hear from our three speakers. And what we'd love you to do is to pop your questions in the chat box if you're in Zoom, or in the thread if you're on Facebook. And we'll have time to address them following the presentations. As always, everyone is welcome here, but our priority is always patient communities. So if you can remind us where you're from in your question, it will help us prioritise the questions to those from patient communities. So now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our three speakers who have generously given their time today. First, we'll hear from Jana Arvanitakis. Now, Jana is the director of the MSAC pre-assessment section. She's been at the Department of Health and Aged Care since 2017, and previously she worked in the post-market review and PBAC areas of the department, before moving across to work in the MSAC Secretariat in 2020. Her team focuses on the functions associated with pre-assessment phase of the MSAC process, which includes providing support to MSAC's PICO Advisory Subcommittee. Now, PICO is just one of the terms we hope to demystify today. Prior to joining the department, she was a community pharmacist with a desire to contribute to the health sector more broadly, and that led her to complete a Masters of Public Health and a Masters of International Public Health, a double degree, and pursue a career in the Australian Public Service. Our second speaker will be someone who's familiar to many of you. It's Dr. Sally Wortley. Sally has a PhD in the field of health economics, health technology, and decision making. She leads the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit within Australia's Office of Health Technology Assessment. And many of you will know Sally as the person you can go to for really useful, specific advice when you're preparing a consumer input for PBAC or MSAC. She's also generously collaborates with us to plan these webinars. And beyond this, Sally maintains an honorary research fellow position at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. She started her career in the disability services sector before becoming an evaluator of health technologies, both here in Australia for MSAC and in the UK for the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, or you might know that as NICE. She's been an active member of the HTA Patient and Citizen Interest Group for many years and has a particular interest in how the perspectives and preferences of patients and the wider public are considered in health policy and decision making. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Clare Stuart. Clare's younger sister, Lizzie, was born with tuberous sclerosis and polycystic kidney disease. Clare's experience as a sibling of someone with a rare genetic disease has led her to work for over 25 years in rare disease health consumer organisations. She has a Master's in Public Health and has worked in policy development with the New South Wales Ministry of Health. Clare is currently the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Mito Foundation, driving improvements to health, disability and social support for people living with mitochondrial disease. So we have a wealth of expertise with us today, and they'll be helping us find out about the process of valuing and the value of patient involvement at the beginning of the process of health technology assessment and helping us learn from a patient organisation's experience of that. So with that, I'd like to ask that we stop sharing the current slide, and I would like to welcome Jana to share her slides and hand over to you, Jana. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I'll just start sharing and let me know if you can see that.
That's perfect. Thanks, Jana.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands across which we meet. Here in Canberra, that's the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us today. So Anne has done a lovely job of introducing me. So I'm Jana Arvanitakis, Director of the MSAC Pre-Assessment Section, and my team is responsible for the pre-assessment phase of the MSAC process, so basically from when an application form is lodged all the way to its consideration by the PICO Advisory Subcommittee or PASC. I'm very happy to be presenting today, and I hope by the end of my presentation you'll have a better understanding of this part of the MSAC process, as well as a better understanding of what a PICO confirmation is and how it informs health technology assessment. So I'll also be covering some process steps in my presentation, especially from the aspect of the applicant. So should you wish to submit an application to MSAC, and I know Sally will be covering how consumers more specifically could contribute. Finally, I know the webinar is being recorded, and I just like to provide a disclaimer that if you are watching this after it's been recorded, given I am covering process information, it is subject to change, so please jump on the MSAC website if you have any more questions and to find the most up-to-date information. So I'll just begin by covering what MSAC does. So the Medical Services Advisory Committee is an independent expert committee that provides advice to government about whether services, tests and technologies should be reimbursed on the Medicare benefit scheme or other funding programs. It does this based on an assessment of whether they're safe, effective, and what is an affordable cost for those services in the Australian community. Importantly, this is based on a comparative assessment, where we compare the safety, efficacy, and cost effectiveness of the new health technology or service to what is currently available. This process that MSAC uses to appraise evidence and provide advice is called Health Technology Assessment, or HTA. MSAC appraises the HTA report, which we call the assessment report, and advises the Minister for Health about whether the health technology should be funded by the relevant funding program. So the HTA process plays a vital role in ensuring the Australian government's objective of delivering a safe, effective and efficient healthcare system. HTA is commonly applied to pharmaceuticals, including vaccines, diagnostic tests, medical devices, surgically implanted prostheses, medical procedures and public health interventions. MSAC is supported by two subcommittees. The first of these subcommittees is the PICO Advisory Subcommittee PASC, and its role, function and the processes it supports will be the focus of today's discussion. So applications to MSAC often come from the pharmaceutical industry, from device companies and other commercial entities. However, they can and have come from professional societies, consumer organisations and individuals. Irrespective of who the applicant is, there is a formal process to apply for MSAC consideration. So if you wanted to submit an application to have a new service or health technology considered by the committee, where would you begin? So the first step is completing and submitting an application form which summarises the request for subsidy. This includes outlining the elements of the PICO as well as other key pieces of information. Sorry, I'll just... So collaboration is usually required to complete the application form, given the level of technical information that has to be provided. So application form intake occurs 3 times a year in March, July and November. So once the department has received the completed application form, it enters what we call the pre-assessment phase of the MSAC process. This is where the application's suitability to commence the MSAC process is assessed. This involves the department confirming that the health technology is eligible for funding by the nominated funding program, most commonly for MSAC, that is the MBS, and that it is necessary or feasible to conduct a health technology assessment to inform a government decision about the proposal or funding. So once it is established that an application is suitable, the pathway through MSAC assessment is determined. So if a PICO is required, the application follows what is known as a standard MSAC pathway, which includes PASC advising and confirming the PICO before the assessment report is developed for consideration by ESC and MSAC in the assessment phase of the process. PICO confirmations are prepared by health technology assessment groups. They're external groups with expertise in HTA, with input from the applicant and usually clinical experts as well. An application usually bypasses PASC if the PICO elements are very clearly defined, which usually occurs if a similar application has already been through the process, there's a pre-existing PICO, and it can be reused to inform the development of a new assessment report. So what is a PICO confirmation? Why is it important? Why do we have this process in place? So most of you would be familiar with the concept of a PICO. It's a mnemonic used to describe the 4 elements of a good clinical foreground question, and those elements are the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcomes. The PICO confirmation in the MSAC process is a document that is prepared before the assessment report is developed, and as I have mentioned, the assessment report is the HTA document MSAC relies on to inform its advice. So really, the PICO confirmation can be thought as the building block of the health technology assessment process, used to inform the questions the assessment report should address, providing the framework on which the HTA is built. So as you can see, the PICO confirmation addresses more than just those 4 PICO criteria, and I'll touch on how some of the key areas of the PICO confirmation emphasised here influence the development of the assessment report. So as previously mentioned, HTA is comparative. Therefore, the assessment questions are most commonly presented in the form of what is the safety, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of the intervention versus the comparator in the target population. So for example, let's suppose I want to apply to MSAC to have a blood test publicly funded on the MBS to diagnose people with type 2 diabetes. By defining the 4 PICO elements, my assessment question might be, what is the safety, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of testing glycated hemoglobin levels, which would be in the blood, which would be the intervention, versus testing sugar levels in the urine, which would be the comparator, in patients presenting with symptoms of type 2 diabetes, which would be the target population. So that's a good start. However, just defining the PICO criteria and creating this overarching assessment question isn't enough. Next, we have to look at the clinical claim being made. Is the application claiming the new health technology is better than the comparator or no worse? So why is that important? Because the PICO confirmation then needs to define the additional assessment questions and the additional evidence that needs to be gathered for the assessment report to support the clinical claim being made. So superiority claims are the main kind of clinical claims MSAC considers, where the intervention is claimed to be better than the comparator. Sometimes an application will claim they're just as good as the comparator, and that's referred to as a non-inferiority claim. So in the case of a clinical claim of superiority, the assessment report will need to provide further evidence that there is an improvement in health outcomes as a result of the intervention. In the case of a test, which is referred to as an investigative technology, as opposed to a medicine, which we refer to as a therapeutic technology, the information from the test would be expected to alter decision-making, treatments received, and ultimately the health of the patient. In some cases, a single study incorporates all of these components, where we have direct from test to health outcomes evidence, but usually it isn't that simple and evidence is fragmented. So the PICO then needs to explicitly discuss how the connections between the evidence available for the test and the evidence available for the relevant health outcomes will be made. So this figure on the slide represents the generic, what we call assessment framework, used to describe how the assessment report will link the evidence available for the test to the evidence available for the health outcomes. So I won't go into this in detail, but what's important to take away is that each step denoted by the numbers in the figure can lead to the development of one or more additional research questions to be addressed in the assessment report. Then we have the clinical management algorithm. The algorithms depict the investigations and the management of the disease or the condition in the Australian target population in the absence and in the presence of the proposed health technology. They're usually presented as flowcharts. Clinical management algorithms are important because they provide clarity about the target population, the intended use of the proposed health technology, the comparator technologies that would be replaced, added to, or displaced, possible changes in patient management due to proposed health technology, and changes in resource use. So ultimately, the algorithms are fundamental in informing the structure of the economic model, and that's a generic diagram of what an economic model could look like. So it does get quite complicated. So I'd just like to reflect for a moment that the clinical management algorithms often seem to be the most challenging area of the PICO confirmation, and usually require the most work to develop during the process. And that's because in order to inform the structure of the economic model, they should be extended to include the expected end of the disease or condition process, or until the algorithms for the intervention, so the proposed health technology, and the main comparators are the same. So this can be challenging, as predicting what change in management might happen by introducing a new health technology is not always straightforward, especially for investigative technologies such as tests, where there can be a number of flow-on consequences to different aspects of patient management as a result of introducing the health technology. Of course, another important section of the PICO confirmation is the summary of consultation input which we receive, which Sally will be addressing in greater detail on how that impacts on the PICO and the assessment report. So PASC meets 3 times a year in April, August and December. PASC's members include people with expertise in decision analysis, health economics, epidemiology, public health, consumer and clinical matters. So its role and function is to confirm in detail the PICO of the proposed health technology, and I won't read through each one of its terms of reference, but I've popped them on the slide and they're also available on the MSAC website. So the applicant, along with their nominated clinical experts, are actively involved at several points in the PASC process, including participating in the pre-PASC teleconference with the department and the Health Technology Assessment Group to discuss questions the group has while it's developing the PICO, reviewing and providing pre-PASC comment on the PICO and the consultation input received prior to PASC consideration, attending the PASC meeting and participating in the discussion of their application, and then following the meeting, reviewing and providing comments on the ratified PICO confirmation prior to its publication on the MSAC website. So I hope this brief presentation has provided you with a bit more of an insight and an understanding of the purpose of this part of the MSAC process and how it directly informs the health technology assessment of applications which subsequently takes place. Hopefully you can also see that this is a part of a process where there is great potential for the consultation input to have a value add, as it can influence those elements of the PICO and thereby directly impact the development of the assessment report, which will then be considered by MSAC. And I know Sally is going to walk us through that next and look forward to that. So if you have any more information, you can check the MSAC website, or you can also email the HTA inbox. I'll just stop sharing there.
Oh, thank you, Jana. That was absolutely fascinating. We've got our term now, our PICO, our population intervention comparator and outcome. And some of those diagrams were really useful for imagining how patient knowledge might open up those pathways with different knowledge. And I'm very conscious that, you know, we've got a really diverse audience here, which is like patient communities, super diverse, people coming with different amounts of knowledge. And so I'm really happy now to hand over to Sally to show you what your knowledge in patient communities can add to this process. And please throw your questions in the chat for Jana, because we will come back to question time at the end of the presentations. But thank you very much for that, Jana. And Sally, if I can get you to share your slides, I will disappear off the screen and hand over to you.
Thanks, Anne. I'm just struggling to find my slides at the moment for some reason.
That's all right.
Hold on.
We're very relaxed here.
Let me just try again. It's always the way.
If they just go in presentation, that's perfect. I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks everyone. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we're meeting. And for me, it's the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So thanks, Jana, and thanks, Anne, for inviting me to be part of this presentation. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a quick overview about the unit and then about the MSAC process, or specifically around the PASC process and how consumers can become involved. So for those that don't know, that we've got a consumer evidence and engagement unit. It was established in 2019, and we're part of the Department of Health and Aged Care. So we sit within the Technology Assessment and Access Division. It's a small team, and we're based in both Sydney and Canberra. And we're located within the Office of Health Technology Assessment and specifically support consultation processes related to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and the Medical Services Advisory Committee. So you would have seen this diagram that Jana had put up about the MSAC process. And what I want you to take away is that there's two distinct blocks of consultation in terms of the MSAC process. One is at this stage before the PASC meeting, so the PICO Advisory Subcommittee meeting. And then there's another block of consultation that happens before the MSAC meets, so the Medical Services Advisory Committee. And in both periods, people are alerted to this through the MSAC e-bulletin, which you can register for. And there's also, it's open to everyone. And all input is considered by MSAC, but the input that's provided at the PASC stage will be considered by PASC as well as MSAC. And as Jana mentioned, there are consumer committee members on each of the committees. So at the PASC at the past meeting, there are 2 consumer committee members. Equally at the MSAC evaluation subcommittee, and at MSAC, there are also 2 consumer committee members on each committee. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this PICO stage, about the PASC consultation stage. So as I said, anyone can provide input on an application to be considered by MSAC. So as an individual consumer, you may hear about an MSAC application through the MSAC e-bulletin, or by looking at the MSAC website, or through the Office of HTA Consultation Hub. You may also hear about it from a clinician or from a consumer organisation. Consumer organisations may also hear equally through these different methods, but they may also receive an email from the department, specifically from our unit, if they've been identified as having an interest in an application. And if they are, then we send them a link to the application form and the consultation survey. And we refer to this as a period of targeted consultation, where we actually target an email to an organisation, letting them know that an application has been put into the MSAC process, where to find information about the application, and a link to the consultation survey, and when the consultation period will shut or close. So I'm just going to show or share what a screen would look like from the MSAC website. And this one is for MSAC application 1668. You can see it's called Whole Body Magnetic Resonance Imaging for Detection of Cancer in Individuals with Germline Pathogenic TP53 Variants. So that's the name of the application form. There's a description of the medical service, and you'll see on every application page on the MSAC website, there's a place where you can sign up to the MSAC e-bulletin. Here on the page, you'll see the application form, and this is what's put in by the applicant. And Jana was talking about the PICO confirmation. So an evaluation group, an independent evaluation group, will use this application form to develop a PICO confirmation, which will be considered by the PICO advisory subcommittee. There's a lot of acronyms, I'm sorry. And you'll also see on the webpage, there's a consultation survey. So after the PASC meeting, the final PICO confirmation will be published on the web page, and it will be down the bottom here, and people can access that. And then finally, when it goes to MSAC and MSAC gives its advice to the government, will be the public summary document. So each application that goes to MSAC will have a page like this where people can access the information. And down the bottom will also say where it's up to in the process, which meeting it's been to. So this is an important source of information. So what type of input can be provided at the PASC stage? So because it is focused on those PICO elements, so about the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcomes, it's worth thinking about what information can be provided at this stage that will look at those questions. So for instance, people might want to put information on who should have access to the medical service if it was funded. Should it be for everyone? Should it be for particular groups? Are there particular groups that might benefit more? For example, younger people, older people, people in different areas, or have particular unmet need. Are there any differences in the technology that's being proposed? So the intervention in the application form, for example, is it a new technology? Do you know of other newer technologies that are coming along in the horizon? What medical services and technologies are people using now? So this idea about the comparator. And what outcomes matter most to those who will be accessing the technology? So the outcomes. So is it a reduction in pain? Might it be survival? Are there outcomes, or what are the outcomes that matter most? These are the elements of the PICO. And this, as Jana was saying, can shape what's going to be put forward in terms of the assessment report. Other things may also There might be other input that can also be provided at this stage, which people might like to have considered by the PASC. And I have to say that while there is a consultation survey, people are welcome to fill that out, but they can also send in emails or letters or other type of documentation that you think would be helpful. So this slide, I've just got a brief example of some information that might have been presented in an application form, and then what's happened after the PASC has had its meeting. And I'm using the same example from 1668, which was the MRI for detection of cancer. So you can see here in the population, the application limited the population to patients between the ages of 18 and 65, but there would have been some discussion at the PASC, possibly with consultation input. And so PASC has advised at this stage that children should also be included in this population. So that's been a change as a result of the discussion at PASC. Again, one of the outcomes in the application form, the main one was listed as the detection rate of cancer as the main outcome. It was noted that consultees thought that the use of technology could provide a psychological benefit to patients and family. And so as a result, and this is coming from the PICO confirmation published after the PASC meeting, you can see that PASC considered that health-related quality of life outcomes should include psychosocial impact and value of knowing. So there's been a change to what was proposed by the applicant to change the scope. So thinking about the assessment report, which is the next stage, we're collecting the evidence. We know that the assessment report will now look for evidence on psychological impact. It will look for evidence for children. And in the final descriptor, and this was a technology that was recommended by MSAC, the final descriptor did not include age. So we can see that there has been an impact at the PASC stage to influence what's happened at the final decision. So as I said, there's two main chunks of consultation. So there's the PICO consultation that happens, and that's prior to the PASC meeting. And there's the consultation that occurs prior to the MSAC meeting. And there's normally more than 6 months between these meetings, so quite a substantial period of time. So there are opportunities between these periods to collect additional evidence. So while at the stage of the PASC consultation, it might be focused on elements of PICO, there are opportunities to collect additional information before it's considered at MSAC. So there might be opportunities to survey members, for example, on outcomes that are known to be important to patients, for example, quality of life, where it's known that there might be limited clinical trial data. So there, in that 6-month window, it might be worth asking particular questions of particular individuals for consumer organisations to collect as part of the second round of consultation. There's also the option of encouraging individuals to provide their own input as part of the consultation process, and again to think about what are the outcomes that have been listed in the PICO confirmation that it would be worthwhile that people would like to comment on. Or there's other opportunities, and I know some of the other organisations have either partnered with a research group or perhaps a postgraduate student working in the area to also work together some additional evidence that might be helpful to be considered by MSAC in their decision making. So Anne mentioned this before, that we do have two systems. One's around looking at medicines and vaccines, and one's looking at medical services and technologies. So I thought I'd just quickly note about the differences. So where we have a discussion, an early discussion looking at the PICO for the MSAC process, it's not the same for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. There is information that's contained on the agenda. So again, it would have the name of the medicine. So we've got then the intervention, we've got the condition, and we've got the patient population. but there's no information available to the public in terms of the comparator or the outcomes that are being proposed by the applicant. So in MSAC, there is availability to look at the application form on the MSAC website, but in the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, the information that's provided to people is the agenda here. And I've got an example of I think from the current agenda. So you will see here you've got an information about medicine, about the condition, and then this is a bit more information about what's being proposed. So you don't get as much information as you would for the MSAC process, but you can get some of those PICO elements. So just to end, because I know we want to have some times for questions, we are in the process of having a consultation, thinking about ways that we can improve. And we have a current survey that we're looking at, and expressions of interest to join a conversation to talk more about how we can improve the way we communicate and engage with consumers and carers in health technologies assessment, particularly thinking about people's information needs and what would be helpful, and thinking about these two different systems and what works and doesn't work. So if people would like to contribute more or think about ways we could improve our system, please jump onto our consultation hub, and it'd be wonderful for people to fill out the survey or to put an expression interest of joining a conversation. So I'm going to leave it there so we have some time for questions. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Sally. That was a terrific presentation. Really interesting to see that example there where the questions that came up about the population and also about, the outcomes, how that took through and changed, what evidence was collected and then how it influenced the outcome. And interesting to compare it with what happens at PBAC. And some of you who contact Patient Voice Initiative will know that we always encourage you to go to the sponsor to ask with PBAC submissions if you can have that PICO information so that you can know what it's being compared to, and know what the intervention is and what populations it's for and what outcomes they're looking at, and that can help you make a more targeted application. And also to those great consultations that Sally was recommending there, we've got a slide at the end and we'll put that up to remind you of some of those addresses, and if you miss them, just contact us and we'll pass all that information on. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Clare Stuart from the Mito Foundation. Clare, if you'd like to share your slides, I will give you the floor now. Thank you so much. That's showing perfectly. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and hi everyone. I'm speaking to you today from Orange in New South Wales on the land of the Wiradjuri people. I just want to quickly pay my respect to their elders, particularly past and present, and any Aboriginal people joining us today. I'm going to try and give another example, second to Sally's, but a recent one, and I don't know the outcome yet, so it feels like it's kind of hot off the press, which may mean it's a little bit unsatisfying to not know what happened, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to share a positive recommendation from MSAC soon. The application I'm going to talk about is for whole genome sequencing or genetic testing for the diagnosis of mitochondrial disease. I won't spend any time giving you the details of mitochondrial disease or Mito Foundation, but I did want to quickly give some context about this application and where we were at the point that it was submitted. So there were four kind of foundations that were important. The first is to understand that Mito is actually a term for around 350 different conditions. And we have a bit of a saying when we do things like educate GPs about mitochondrial disease. We talk about any symptom, any organ, any age. And Mito's also has a bit of a nickname in the kind of Mito literature of the notorious masquerader. So it's incredibly difficult to precisely diagnose, and lots of evidence, like many rare conditions, of very long diagnostic odysseys. We tend to talk about years rather than months, but in Mito we also talk about generations rather than years or even decades. We had a family survey recently, and someone said that, you know, the biggest change in their life was finally having a name for something that had been previously known as the family curse. So, you know, and people get a diagnosis of Mito, but they have probably Mito still on their medical records. The second foundation that's important to understand is that, like many rare conditions and many genetic conditions, testing was incredibly difficult to access through state block-funded services. People with Mito were generally not prioritised because there's limited clinical utility of having a genomic test. There's no precision therapies that treat particular genotypes, for example. And for many people, there wasn't obvious reproductive utility. So that was a challenge in the current system. The third foundation was that we had some really good research supporting a genomics first approach and the benefit of that, including an economic evaluation that had already been published for a paediatric population that showed doing genetic testing earlier in the diagnostic process would actually save our system money. And the other foundation that we had in mind when we started this process was understanding that MSAC had recently made many positive recommendations for similar submissions for funding of genomic tests. The two examples that are worth mentioning are in 2020, the new item number for childhood syndromes and intellectual disability for children 10 years and under, and also one that played on our mind as we entered this process around genetic testing for heritable or inheritable kidney disease. So we had those sort of four foundations to build on. Are we advancing? There we are. So I wanted to quickly go through what we did at Mito Foundation. We wanted to make sure that the opinions and the experiences of the Australian Mito community were well understood and involved in this process. The first thing we did was research, and I recommend that anyone in this space definitely starts with, early in their process, having a chat to the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit. So I reached out to Sally. As I said, we understood recent submissions, and this was the first time I had been involved in an MSAC application. So I did my background reading and talking to get familiar with this PICO concept and what was the opportunity that was provided to us by being able to submit to the pre-PASC meeting, because that was all new to me. So we did that sort of research. And then the focus of what I'm going to talk to you about is around our pre-PASC submission. And the work that we did there was interviewing community members, so people living with Mito and their family members. We consulted our advisors, our clinical and research advisors that were active in this space to get opinions. And we also briefed some other organisations, and particularly some of the genetic and rare disease peak bodies, but also some overlapping organisations. So we, for example, Childhood Dementia Initiative, there are several forms of Mito that are considered childhood dementias. So that advocacy organisation was also very interested in this. But with us briefing them, the feedback we've gotten is that that helped them to get involved in this without having to do all the legwork that we were doing. And just for context, more recently, we also did a submission at that second point in the MSAC process. So that was then involving going back and having a look at the confirmed PICO and seeing, you know, what sort of things that we had submitted on had been incorporated, what hadn't. Had another chat to Sally, and we reused and added to our first submission in the second stage. I've said all that, keep going. So coming back to our new favourite acronym, and I always love a compound acronym, so the fact that it's PICO and then it's the PICO Advisory Subcommittee, so you've got PASC having an acronym within it, kind of always makes us laugh as to how often difficult to understand this terminology is. The gist of our submission, which is publicly available on our website, I'll put the link at the end of this if you wanted to read it. We had something to say around population. So our point of view on population after talking to the Mito community and our advisors was that we really wanted to keep the population as flexible as possible. It's very challenging to define who exactly is considered someone that possibly has Mito, given that any symptom, any organ, any age kind of rule of thumb that we have, but we wanted to push as hard as we could to make sure that that was more inclusive rather than too tight, and particularly for the benefit of being able to reduce the number of clinical tests that had to occur before a genetic test could be accessed. Now, at one end of the spectrum, you'd say, therefore, Medicare should fund, population-wide screening for Mito. We certainly weren't advocating that. We wanted to avoid really invasive tests, particularly those that involved anaesthetic, because of the particular impact and risk that has for someone that has Mito. On the eye, the intervention, we did make some points in our submission. We relied on others to make them more eloquently and technically, but we did see that there was a role for us to make a point that from a patient point of view, having whole genome sequencing over other forms of testing was really important, particularly from the idea of getting an answer sooner rather than later. So the two-stage process of cheaper test whole exome sequencing first and potentially doing whole genome sequencing later on may have at a population level saved our government money, but what does that delay mean to patients? We made a point around that. The comparator, we also just made some points to say that, look, those clinical management pathways that Jana talked about for diabetes look pretty simple. Even the one in the application for this MSAC application looked relatively simple. The everyday lived experience is certainly that clinical management pathway is incredibly complex depending on the presenting sign that the person with Mito has and varies a lot. So the point we made in our pre-PASC submission is please consult widely to get a flavour of the huge variation in practice that this has because of how people present, but also the different way that our health services are organised. But most of our first submission was all about outcomes. And I think in our experience, particularly with diagnostics, I expect that's possibly going to be a similar focus for many other similar applications. We really did this as a bottom-up. So we did a lot of interviews. I think there was something like 15 interviews, talking to people about what they felt about their own diagnostic process, whether that was in the recent past or was still ongoing, and what they saw was the key benefits of a potential genetic test. And these were the top 10 things that we came up with. We tried to fit all of those different points of view and experiences under these 10, so it was quite comprehensive. I won't read through them, but really it was about putting some more detail and some more Mito-specific experiences behind what often gets referred to as the value of knowing. So we gave some examples, and I'm going to flick on to the next slide for some more accurate quotes, I suppose, that I can paraphrase. And we really hinged the submission on quotes like this. So this was one of the people that volunteers very closely with us. This is talking about things like exercise stress tests, huge amount of health resources that were being used. All of these things could be had more informed decision making for the person and their clinicians if they had an accurate genetic testing option earlier. And then the second quote I've chosen is just a bit of an example around that psychosocial impact, but not talking about it in the abstract, but really giving some concrete examples of what it means to live with this uncertainty for an extended period of time. And if even for out of 100 people that go through this, even if only 50 get that accelerated precise diagnosis, think of the kind of mental health impacts that could be avoided or reduced through that. So our submission is very much full of quotes like that grouped under those 10 outcomes that we heard from the Mito community that were important for them. I think I don't have anything to add to that. I wanted to quickly finish by summarising what we learnt at Mito Foundation from this process. We learnt that absolutely community members are really willing to share their stories, but mostly wanted to share them with us. So we went out to the community and said, this is what's happening, this submission's gone in, we really want you to get involved. We had about 20 or so people contact us as a result of that. Only one person chose to submit independently, and we encourage people to do that. We had one person who asked us to, instead of incorporating their feedback in our submission in little pieces, can you please add my whole story as an appendix? And so we did that as well. So we learned the community was willing to share, but they really wanted us to be a kind of broker in that arrangement rather than engage directly. We'll continue to experiment with that. Maybe it was the way we presented it, but we felt that willing, but feeling a bit isolated from the overall process. So our role was important. Speed was really important. We wanted to get these outcomes particularly in there before the PICO was generated, and that economic evaluation was done on the basis of that. We felt that that was important to get that early. We've also found that we've used the insights we gathered from the community for other purposes, particularly around diagnosis. We did find it difficult to decide what to focus on, and it was really talking to the community as well as our advisors that helped us understand what was our unique role, what was the unique voice of the community in this process that no one else could provide, things that there isn't published evidence on. We learned that it was really important to seek advice and collaborate with others. And I mentioned before that we talked to many other NGOs about this and gave them some extra information to both motivate and inform their own submissions. And we also learned that seeing the PICO reflect community's input was really validating. Look, maybe it means that the experts and the published literature matched the community, but we like to think that the community input that we provided helped to make the PICO reflect what the community thought. And the other really positive thing that we found through getting involved in this process, knowing that we don't know the outcome, so even if we get a negative outcome, we'll strategize with our stakeholders and figure out the next steps. But we did get some totally unsolicited feedback from someone in our community that was involved in the process and read it and just felt incredibly empowered and heard through that process. So even if this doesn't feed into a positive recommendation this time around, we know we have really engaged and helped the community feel heard. And if there are, gaps in the evidence, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But at the moment, that was a really positive experience for our community and us as an organisation. That's all I had to share, Anne.
Well, thank you, because there was an awful lot in that, Claire, that you shared, and I really appreciate it. And there's lots that I take away from them. I mean, just one of the small nuggets I was thinking about is that reflection you had on whether people wanted to come to you to share their story or whether they wanted to do it independently. And one of the things I think that, isn't available all around the world in different HTA systems is this ability for our health technology assessment system to learn from patients who may want to come individually or patients who want to come through organisations. And I hear this sometimes reduced to an either or, and I love that in Australia it's an and, because that can speak to different needs in our patient communities. And that work you did to collaborate, because Jana, I'm glad that Jana and Sally and Claire are all on camera again. Jana, when I was looking at that process this morning, it's not simple. It's not something we can quickly get our heads around. But, you did a great job in helping us understand where the patient knowledge comes in that. But I love to hear that patient communities are working together to get efficiencies in this process. So thank you for that. And I was interested, Claire, my first questions to you, and I encourage people to put questions in the chat because otherwise I will take the whole space with my questions. But we have got a few minutes for questions. But Claire, my first question was, when you came back to the survey part, I just wondered what sort of issues were coming up in that second, sorry, not the survey part, the first part is the survey, the second part when you could give input. So after you had the PICO confirmation, what sort of information did you find useful to add at that time? I know I'm jumping ahead of beginnings now, but it's terribly interesting.
So again, hard to know whether it was useful because we haven't seen the outcomes of the ESC or the MSAC meetings. And I did reach out to Sally and say, I don't see what we should be saying next. And Sally provided a couple of pointers on particular aspects that there was not really good published evidence about, and so they probably weren't very well incorporated into a quantified economic review and economic evaluation. So what we focused on, this is kind of using my memory, was one around the harms of a particular test that in this MSAC, this proposed clinical pathway was going to be put after the genetic testing. So for a lot of people, it would be avoided if the genetic testing showed a definitive result. So we went out to the community and asked for examples of people's experience with this particularly invasive test that was currently used for diagnosing Mito. So we focused on that information gap. We didn't actually get a lot of feedback on that point, which was interesting. So we kind of made some points and pulled out some things from the literature and provided a point of view based on what we knew. And then the other thing that we ended up doing was, I think I talked to 2 or 3 extra Mito community members, and one in particular had a very compelling story that effectively provided another illustration of how some of these different issues of the current way that Mito was diagnosed presented in a real person's life. And that included a kind of diagnosis of Munchausen by proxy and the impact that that had on that family of having both, the mental health and the kind of family unity impacts of that sort of medical conclusion, which turned out to be wrong, but also what it meant for that person, that child with Mito, to get a definitive diagnosis through genetic testing and how that changed their care. The challenge in this space is that there aren't, as I said, there aren't precision treatments at the moment that are available for a particular genetic cause of Mito. But once we know that it is Mito, there are things we can do. And so that family story illustrated how that child's care changed. And I think the illustration there was when that child then had an episode, a stroke-like episode, a kind of Mito attack, as they call it, instead of being in hospital for 6 months of the year, the following year, knowing that it was Mito, they were only in hospital for a month in total. So we provided another couple of stories. I don't know if it helped, hard to tell. The feedback I often give to Joe and Sally is it's just about getting some feedback back to go, was what we provided useful or not? So I'm hoping that we'll get some information about that in the next couple of weeks.
Oh, thank you for that, Claire. And sorry, I should have said you can stop sharing your slides. So I'll
don't want that
you to
quote up there anymore.
No, it's a terrific quote though, and I really appreciate it. And may I? Oh, look, I was going to ask one of my questions, but I can see someone else has asked one, so I'm going to jump in there. So Catherine Milne has said that she's from Rare Insights Advisory, and she says, I'm currently investigating the pre-application process. Claire, I'm interested in Mito's lessons learned. Having worked through the application now, what advice would you give other organisations regarding how to prepare for submitting an application? Thanks for that, Catherine. So back to you, Claire.
I'm interested to get Jana and Sally's answers to that too. Hi, Catherine. So if we had our time again, or if I could advise other groups of people with a particular interest in a particular health technology, and I'm particularly thinking about genetic diagnosis or diagnostic type technologies now, get all the stakeholders together before submission. One of the frustrating parts was that we had multiple groups in Australia working towards this particular goal of increasing access to genomic testing, or a genomics first approach to diagnosing Mito. And, it would have been good if we had been able to line up a few more bits of evidence. I think the process, because it goes on for so long, has caught up with some of those projects where there's new evidence emerging, but it would have been great if we were more transparent and collaborative from the beginning. So my advice to organisations or consortiums or groups of individuals looking to submit for these sorts of things, where there isn't a clear sponsor, where it's more of a group of people that know about a topic and can see the usefulness of a technology, is just to be a little bit more collaborative and work together right from pre-application process.
Thanks, Claire. And I can see now that we're almost on time, but I'd love to hear a bit more from Jana and Sally. So Jana, if I may go to you, I'd love any advice that you might give here.
So I think Claire's advice really hits the nail on the head, especially when it's not a commercial entity that's putting through an application, and it is up to a consumer organisation or others with an interest to put forward the application. That collaborative effort is really required, because you don't have the resources available that all of these pharma or medical device companies have, and getting that expertise into different aspects of the patient journey and management is really important from the consumer perspective, and then also the clinical perspective as well. So but I would also encourage anybody who's interested in putting forward an application to take up the offer of, we offer pre-submission meetings at the department before you submit your application form. And that's just by contacting us through that HTA inbox, hta@health.gov.au. to set up a pre-submission meeting with the department where, you know, we ask you to provide a bit of a briefing about what the application is about, and then can really kind of provide some focused and targeted advice as to, for example, what evidence might be required or what the approach to the assessment might be, and, you know, what are those gaps and those links that need to be made during the assessment phase to really bring the case forward and the application forward for MSAC consideration. I just want to also highlight that application form is available on the MSAC website, so you can actually see what you need to populate before you submit it, as well as application form instructions. It is currently transitioning to being an online process through the health products portal, but we haven't completed that transition quite as yet, so that's also helpful. And also knowing that as an applicant, especially in this part of the process, you can nominate experts. Usually they're clinical experts that are nominated to support the applicant through the process, but they don't have to be. So experts to also assist in that process going forward. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Jana and Sally. I'm ignoring the clock because I'd love to hear from you before we wrap up.
Nothing more other than to say, and you can elect for the department to do the assessment report if you are a consumer organisation. So don't feel you need to do the assessment report with the economics. You don't need to. So it's about filling out the application form, and I encourage people to do the pre-submission meeting.
A very important addition. Thank you, Sally. And I wonder if I can get Clare Stuart to share my slides. Thank you, Clare, for stepping in when technology let me down today. But as we wrap up, I would love to give my sincere thanks to our panelists, Jana and Sally and Clare. Thank you. We've learned so much over the last hour, and thank you for the expertise and experience that you've shared. But also, could I just say the considerable time that you've given to the preparation of this? You're three exceptionally busy people, and I'm really grateful for that. And if I jump to that next slide, I just want to thank our 2022 gold and silver sponsors at Patient Voice Initiative. And there they are. Thank you very much to all our sponsors. It's wonderful having your support. And there's another slide following that one. Thank you also to our silver sponsors. And on our final slide, I just want to bring up these are some of the reminders of some of the websites we've talked about here today. So you can see that you can follow the Office of HTA Consultation Hub, and you can get to the consultations that are currently open for medicines and also for medical services. And that very important survey that Sally mentioned about the conversations for change and also expressions of interest in ongoing involvement there. You can see the email address to contact the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit. And then we've put our patient voice resources down there. And the one I've highlighted today is our fairly new one about giving input about funding for new medical services. And of course, you can see our email address there. And our wonderful IT person, Ray, is just suggesting he will give us some shorter links for that. So thank you, Ray, for always solving our IT for us. So thank you again to everyone. And with that, we'll end for today. Thanks for joining us.